I'm Amanda, 27, female. I live with my husband, Jake, in a small apartment that's always smelled faintly of sawdust and coffee. I manage a busy retail store, and he teaches woodshop at the local high school, a job he loves more than anything. We've always believed that a life built with your own two hands, no matter how modest, is a life worth living. But we soon learned that his family believed the only thing worth anything was a dollar sign, and they were about to find out just how much my husband was truly worth. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. For the first 3 years of our marriage, Sundays were not a day of rest. They were a day of obligation. Every Sunday at precisely 6 p.m., Jake and I would drive to his mother Susan's immaculately clean, personality-free house for the weekly family dinner. It was a tradition that started long before I was in the picture, a non-negotiable summons that felt more like a parole check-in than a family gathering. The attendees were always the same: Susan, the self-appointed matriarch; Jake's older brother, Kevin, a financial analyst who wore his ambition like an expensive tailored suit; and us, the designated disappointments. The house itself was a testament to their values. Everything was beige, chrome, or glass. It was a place designed to be looked at, not lived in. There were no scuff marks on the floor, no cozy blankets on the couches, no pictures of Jake's woodworking projects on the walls. There were, however, plenty of framed photos of Kevin shaking hands with important-looking men in suits. Susan made sure every guest saw them. The dinners followed a script we knew by heart. We'd start with polite, surface-level chatter. I'd talk about work at the store, and Susan would offer unsolicited advice on how I could climb the ladder faster. Then, the conversation would inevitably turn to Kevin, his latest deal, his new car, his upcoming trip to a luxury resort. Susan would beam with pride, her voice dripping with admiration. Kevin just closed a massive account for his firm. She'd announce, as if he'd single-handedly solved world hunger. They're already talking about making him a junior partner. Aren't we proud, Jake? Jake would just nod and smile, a tight, practiced expression he had perfected over the years. That's great, Kevin, congratulations. The praise for Kevin was always the setup. The punchline was always Jake. And how are things at the school, Jake? Susan would ask, her tone shifting from adoration to condescending pity. Still playing with wood chips and glue. I hope those kids appreciate the effort you put in. Kevin would smirk into his wine glass. Yeah, little bro. Building any birdhouses lately? My portfolio is up 12% this quarter. How many birdhouses is that worth? They thought they were being clever, their insults couched in faux concern and brotherly teasing. But the message was always clear: you are less. Your life, your passion, your career, it is all a joke to us. Jake, bless his heart, had the patience of a saint. He'd weathered this storm his entire life. He loved his craft, and he was a brilliant teacher. He found meaning in showing teenagers how to create something beautiful and functional from a simple block of wood. He didn't need a six-figure salary to feel fulfilled, and that simple fact seemed to offend his mother and brother on a fundamental level. I, on the other hand, was not as patient. I saw the way their words chipped away at him, the flicker of hurt in his eyes that he tried so hard to hide. I'd squeeze his hand under the table, a silent signal of support. After every dinner, the car ride home would be quiet. He'd stare out the window, the weight of his family's judgment pressing down on him. It's just how they are, Amanda, he'd say quietly. It doesn't mean anything. But it did. It meant everything. It was a constant reminder that to the two people who were supposed to be his biggest supporters, he would never be enough. We were surviving, paying our bills, and saving what little we could. We were happy with each other, but in their world, happiness wasn't measured in love or contentment. It was measured in stock options and square footage, and by that metric, we were failing spectacularly. The Sunday dinners were a weekly performance review of that failure. The dream of owning our own home was something Jake and I talked about constantly. Not a mansion like Kevin's or a sterile showcase like Susan's, but a small place with a yard for a dog, and most importantly, a garage that Jake could convert into a proper workshop. For years, we had been diligently saving every spare dollar. We cut coupons, packed our lunches, and skipped expensive vacations. We had finally saved up a respectable amount, but with the housing market being what it was, we were still just short of the 20% down payment we needed to avoid a crushing mortgage insurance premium. After weeks of going over our budget, we came to a difficult conclusion. We needed help. The idea of asking his family for a loan felt like swallowing glass, but it seemed like our only option. We weren't asking for a handout, just a short-term loan that we would pay back with interest. "It's family," Jake said, trying to convince himself as much as me. "It's just a simple business transaction. They'll understand." I was skeptical, but I saw the hope in his eyes and couldn't bring myself to crush it. We decided to ask them at the next Sunday dinner, hoping that a face-to-face request would feel more personal and sincere. We prepared a folder with our budget, our savings statements, and a proposed repayment plan. We were treating it with the seriousness it deserved. When the time came, after the usual round of praise for Kevin and pity for Jake, Jake cleared his throat. "Mom, Kevin," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves I could feel radiating from him. "Amanda and I have something we'd like to ask you. We're trying to buy a house and we're a little short on the down payment. We were hoping you might consider giving us a loan." He slid the folder across the glass table. Kevin didn't even open it. He picked it up, weighed it in his hand for a second, and dropped it with a dismissive thud. Then he started to laugh. It wasn't a gentle chuckle. It was a loud, barking laugh filled with derision. Susan joined in, a high-pitched titter that grated on my nerves. "Alone," Kevin finally gasped, wiping a tear from his eye. "Jake, you can barely manage your teacher's salary. What makes you think you can manage a mortgage, and you want us to invest in that?" Susan adopted her concerned tone. "Oh, sweetie," she said, reaching over to pat Jake's arm. "We just don't think you're responsible enough for that kind of commitment. The family's money needs to be handled by people who understand real investments. It's for your own good, you understand. We can't enable your financial instability." The humiliation was a physical thing. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. They hadn't just said no, they had mocked us. They had called Jake irresponsible and unstable, all while positioning themselves as the wise, benevolent guardians of the family fortune. Jake just sat there, his face pale, his folder lying ignored on the table between us. He calmly collected it, stood up, and said, "Okay, I understand." We left without another word. The lie came a week later. We were scrolling through social media one evening when a post from one of Kevin's friends popped up. It was a picture of Kevin standing next to a gleaming brand new sports car, a machine that cost more than the entire down payment we had asked for. The caption read, "Huge congrats to Kevin on the new ride. Some guys have all the luck." But it was the first comment that made my blood run cold. It was from Kevin himself. He had tagged his mother, Susan, and written, "Couldn't have done it without you, Mom. Thanks for helping me with this awesome investment." An investment. They had called his luxury car an investment, while our dream of a home was a liability. The money was there. It was always there. They had lied to our faces, not because they couldn't help, but because they enjoyed the power of saying no. They enjoyed making Jake feel small. In that moment, sitting in our cramped apartment, staring at the picture of that ridiculous car, something inside me snapped. The years of quiet resentment hardened into a cold, clear resolve. They had picked the wrong fight. The week following the refusal was one of the hardest in our marriage. Jake was completely defeated. The cheerful, optimistic man I loved was replaced by a quiet, somber shadow. He stopped whistling in the mornings and spent his evenings staring blankly at the television. He had finally accepted what I had known for a long time. His family would never see his worth. The mockery was one thing, but the deliberate, cruel lie about the money had broken something inside him. He felt foolish for even asking, for believing, for a single moment, that they might actually care. One evening, trying to pull him out of his funk, I suggested we clean out the small storage locker in our attic. It was filled with boxes we hadn't opened since we moved in. "Maybe we'll find some old treasures," I said, trying to sound cheerful. He agreed, likely just for something to do. Most of the boxes were filled with old college textbooks and things we no longer needed. But in the very back, there was a sealed cardboard box with "Jake from Grandpa" written on the side in faded marker. Jake's grandfather, Arthur, had passed away nearly 10 years ago. He was the founder of the family business, a successful construction supply company that Kevin and Susan now controlled. Arthur had been a carpenter by trade, a man who, much like Jake, believed in the value of honest work and quality craftsmanship. He and Jake had been incredibly close. Before he died, he had given Jake this box of his personal effects. Jake's mood shifted slightly as he opened it. A wave of nostalgia seemed to wash over him. Inside were things that smelled of cedar and old paper, a worn leather tool belt, a collection of hand-carved wooden figures, and a stack of old photographs. There was one of a young Jake, probably about 10 years old, standing proudly next to his grandfather in a workshop, both of them covered in sawdust. For the first time in days, Jake smiled a genuine smile. At the very bottom of the box, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick, leather-bound book. It was a ledger, the kind with marbled and papers and columns ruled in faint blue ink. It wasn't a company account book. The entries were too personal, written in Arthur's elegant, looping cursive. It was his private journal, detailing the early days of the business. I remember him writing in this every night, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. He said it was the company's real history, not the one the accountant saw. We sat on the floor of our dusty attic and began to read. The first pages were filled with notes on lumber prices, early client accounts, and sketches of building plans. But as we turned the pages, the entries became more personal. Arthur wrote about his dreams for the company, his frustrations with suppliers, and his pride in his work. He also wrote about his family. He expressed concern over his sons, Jake's late father's, fixation on money and status, and he wrote about Susan's expensive tastes. But then we found it, an entry dated on Jake's first birthday. Arthur had written, "Jake is 1 year old today. I see the same spark in him that I had when I was a boy. He is a builder. I worry that his parents will not nurture that. They only see the world in dollars and cents. They will not guide him properly. So I must." The entry continued, and as we read, my heart began to pound. "Today, I have taken a significant block of my own founder's shares, 20% of the entire company, and placed them into an irrevocable trust in Jake's name. I have structured it so that my wife and then my son will be the trustees, but they cannot touch the principal. It is for Jake and Jake alone. Receive when he is of an age and mind to use it wisely. This will be his foundation, a way to ensure he can build his own life, free from the judgment of those who don't understand his value. The official documents are with my attorney, Mr. Gable. This ledger is my personal record, my testament." My grandson. We stared at the page, then at each other. 20%, a trust, hidden for 27 years. Susan, who became the executor after Jake's father passed away, had to have known. She had to have received statements, notices, documents. She had known about this all along. While she and Kevin were mocking Jake for his modest income, they were sitting on a fortune that was rightfully his. It wasn't just a loan they had denied him. They had stolen his entire inheritance. The dust motes dancing in the single attic light bulb seemed to swirl around us, illuminating a secret that had the power to change everything. The attic felt like a different world when we came back down. The weight of the discovery was immense, a mixture of shock, anger, and a bewildering sense of vindication. We reread the ledger entry a dozen times, the words burning into our minds. It wasn't just a vague wish. It was a clear, detailed plan. Founder's shares, an irrevocable trust. His grandfather had tried to protect him. Our first step was clear. We had to find the attorney, Mr. Gable. A quick online search delivered our first roadblock. The law firm of Gable and Associates had closed down over a decade ago. Mr. Gable himself, if he was even still alive, would be well into his 90s. We spent the next 2 days making calls, searching online databases, and hitting one dead end after another. It felt hopeless. I was starting to fear that the paper trail had gone cold years ago. Then I had an idea. I searched the State Bar Association's records not for the firm, but for Mr. Gable himself. I found his entry, Robert Gable, retired. More importantly, it listed the lawyer who had formally taken over his pending case files upon his retirement. His name was David Chen. His office was downtown. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number. I explained the situation as calmly as I could to a paralegal, who put me on a brief hold. I expected to be told the files were long gone, archived or destroyed. But the voice that came on the line next was calm and professional. "This is David Chen. You're looking for estate files related to Arthur Miller. That's a name I haven't heard in a while. My firm acquired Mr. Gable's archives when he retired. The files are in deep storage, but if they exist, we have them. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" Walking into David Chen's office felt surreal. It was a modern, respectable firm, a world away from the dusty attic where our journey had begun. David was a man in his mid-40s with a sharp, intelligent gaze. He listened intently as Jake recounted the story of the Sunday dinners, the loan, and the discovery of the ledger. We showed him the entry. He examined the page, his expression unreadable. "This is a compelling piece of personal evidence," he said, handing the ledger back carefully. "But it's not legally binding on its own. Everything depends on what's in Mr. Gable's files." He excused himself and returned 20 minutes later with a thick, brittle-looking accordion file labeled Miller, Arthur Estate. He opened it on the large conference table, and the smell of old paper filled the room. Inside were stacks of documents, yellowed with age. David's fingers moved through them with practiced efficiency. He pulled out a thick, bound document. On the cover, in typed letters, were the words, "The Arthur Miller Grandchild Trust." "Well," David said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "it looks like Grandpa was a very smart man." He spent the next hour walking us through the legal jargon. It was exactly as the ledger had described. 20% of the company's original founding shares were in the trust. Over the years, through stock splits and company growth, the value of that holding had ballooned. Susan was indeed the current trustee, a fiduciary duty she had inherited after Jake's father passed. As trustee, she was legally obligated to manage the trust in Jake's best interest and to inform him of its existence. David then pulled out another folder. It was a record of correspondence every year for the last 27 years. David explained, "The trust's accounting firm has sent a certified letter to the trustee, first your father, now your mother, detailing the trust's holdings and value. We have delivery confirmation receipts for every single one." He fanned out a stack of green certified mail receipts, each one signed by Susan. She hadn't just forgotten. She had actively received information about the trust year after year and had willfully concealed it. The paper trail was complete. It wasn't just a moral failing. It was a profound legal betrayal. And according to the documents in front of us, it was a betrayal that was about to have very serious consequences for her and Kevin. As we sat in the sterile quiet of the conference room, David Chen leaned forward, his expression shifting from one of professional curiosity to that of a focused strategist. "Your grandfather," he said, tapping a finger on the trust document, "was not only a smart businessman, but he was also a man who understood the character of his own family. He anticipated this exact scenario. He flipped to a section of the trust agreement marked with a small, faded tab. He included a very specific, and I must say, very clever provision. I've taken the liberty of calling it the Founder's Clause." David cleared his throat and began to read aloud. The language was dense and legal, but the meaning was crystal clear. The clause stated that the trustee, Susan, had a non-negotiable fiduciary duty to inform the beneficiary, Jacob, the trust's existence upon his 25th birthday. It gave her a grace period of 1 year to do so. If she failed to make this formal notification, or if it was ever proven that she took deliberate action to conceal the trust from the beneficiary, it would be deemed a breach of sacred duty, and the penalty for that breach was catastrophic for her. The clause stipulated that upon proven concealment, 2 things would happen immediately and irrevocably. First, Susan would be removed as trustee, effective immediately. Second, and this was the masterstroke, all conditions on the trust would be dissolved. The shares and all their accumulated value would not just be managed on Jake's behalf, they would transfer directly and fully into his control. This included full voting rights associated with the shares. "What does that mean exactly?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. David looked up from the document, a glint in his eye. "It means, Jake, that your grandfather didn't just leave you money. He left you the company, that 20% of Founder's shares, after decades of growth and stock splits, now represents a 51% controlling interest in Miller Construction Supply." The air left my lungs. 51%. It wasn't just a piece of the pie, it was the whole bakery. Susan and Kevin had spent years lording their power and wealth over us, wealth derived from a company they didn't even truly control. They were caretakers of a kingdom that belonged to the very person they scorned. "They have been sending her annual statements," I said, thinking back to the signed receipts. She knew every year, and she said nothing. "Precisely," David confirmed. "She willfully breached her sacred duty. The Founder's Clause is now in full effect. Legally, Jake, you already own the company. They just don't know it yet." The plan from there came together quickly. David advised against a drawn-out court battle. A public lawsuit would be messy and could damage the company's reputation. The evidence was so ironclad, he explained, that a direct confrontation was the best approach. There was no argument they could make, no defense they could mount. The documents, signed and verified, spoke for themselves. Susan had signed for the certified letters, year after year. Her own signature would be her undoing. David proposed a formal meeting. He would send a letter on his firm's letterhead, summoning Susan and Kevin, in their capacity as board members, to an urgent shareholder meeting at his office. The letter wouldn't specify the agenda, only that it was mandatory. "They will come in expecting to bully you," David warned. "They will be arrogant, dismissive, and angry that you've involved a lawyer. Do not engage. Let the documents do the talking. Let me do the talking. Your power right now is in your silence." Leaving his office that day, the world felt tilted on its axis. We had walked in as a teacher and a retail manager, hoping to find a small inheritance. We were walking out as the majority owners of a multi-million-dollar company. The irony was staggering. The family who had called Jake a failure was about to find out that he was, in fact, their boss. The legal checkmate was in place. All we had to do was move the final piece. The day of the meeting arrived cloaked in a tense gray drizzle that perfectly matched our mood. Jake was quiet during the drive to David's office, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He wasn't scared, but he was somber. This wasn't just a business transaction for him. It was the final, painful severing of a family tie, a tie he had tried to maintain his whole life out of a sense of duty and a sliver of hope. We were seated in the same conference room as before when Susan and Kevin arrived. They swept in 10 minutes late, dripping disdain. Kevin was on his phone, barking orders at someone, while Susan surveyed the room as if it were contaminated. "Really, Jake?" Kevin said, not even bothering to look at him as he slid into a chair. "Lawyers, is this your new strategy for begging? It's pathetic." Susan sniffed, directing her question to David. "I hope you're not charging him by the hour, because I can assure you, this will be a very short meeting. We have nothing to say to him." David Chen remained perfectly calm. He gestured to the chairs opposite us. "Please have a seat. This is an official shareholder meeting of Miller Construction Supply. Your attendance is required." The word shareholder made Kevin pause. He shot a confused look at his mother, but they sat down. "Fine," he snapped. "Let's get this over with." David didn't waste any time. He slid 2 thick, bound documents across the polished table. "Before we begin, I'd like you both to review these. This is a copy of the Arthur Miller Grandchild Trust, established for the benefit of Jacob Miller." Susan's face, which had been a mask of bored arrogance, flickered with the first sign of panic. Kevin, however, just scoffed. "A trust? Don't be ridiculous. My grandfather left everything to my father, who left it to my mother. It's all very simple." On the contrary, David said smoothly, "It's a bit more complex. Please turn to page 12, section 4, the Founder's Clause." He waited a beat as they fumbled through the pages. He then proceeded to lay out the entire story, his voice calm and methodical. He explained the creation of the trust, the 20% of Founder's shares, and the strict fiduciary duty of the trustee. Susan's face was losing its color. This is a misunderstanding," she stammered. "Is it?" David asked politely. He then produced the next file, a stack of photocopied certified mail receipts, each one bearing Susan's neat, tidy signature. "These are delivery confirmations for the annual trust statements sent to you every year for the past 18 years, since you became the trustee. You have been fully aware of the trust's existence and its terms. You willfully concealed it from the beneficiary, which is a direct violation of Founder's Clause." Kevin's face was a storm of confusion and rage. "What are you talking about? What shares?" "The shares that now represent a 51% controlling interest in the company," David said, delivering the final blow. "As of this moment, due to a severe breach of fiduciary duty, Susan has been legally removed as trustee, and full ownership and voting rights of that 51% stake have been transferred to their rightful owner, Jake." Silence. The sound of the rain against the window was the only noise in the room. Susan looked like she had seen a ghost. Kevin's jaw was hanging open. He looked from the documents to Jake, his eyes wide with disbelief. You can't be serious," he sputtered. "This is a joke. It's a forgery. I assure you, it is all perfectly legal and verified," David said, sliding one last document across the table. "And as the new majority shareholder, Jake's first order of business is to call a vote on the current leadership of the board." For the first time, Jake spoke. His voice was quiet, but held an unshakable firmness. "I vote to remove Susan Miller and Kevin Miller from the board of directors and terminate their employment, effective immediately." The reality of the situation finally crashed down on them. Kevin started yelling, threatening lawsuits, calling us thieves. Susan just sat there, silent and ashen, her entire world crumbling around her. David calmly informed them that any legal challenge would be fruitless and would likely result in them facing criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. They were checkmated. They had mocked Jake for playing with wood chips, and now he owned the entire lumber yard. In the aftermath of that meeting, Susan and Kevin didn't go quietly, but they did go quickly. Faced with the undeniable evidence and the threat of legal action that could land them in jail, they had no choice. David Chen drafted a severance agreement that was, in his words, far more generous than they deserve. It was conditional on them signing a non-disclosure agreement and relinquishing any and all future claims to the company. They signed. Within a week, they had cleared out their desks. We never had a Sunday dinner again. Taking over the company was like stepping into a different universe. We discovered that for all their talk of real investments, Susan and Kevin had been running the business into the ground. They had been focused on flashy, high-margin products while neglecting the core principles of quality and customer service that Arthur had built his legacy on. They were bleeding money on vanity projects and had a reputation among their long-term clients for being arrogant and unreliable. The first few months were a whirlwind. Jake resigned from his teaching position, a bittersweet decision, but he knew this was where he needed to be. He walked the factory floor, talking to the employees, many of whom had been hired by his grandfather. He listened to their frustrations and their ideas. He wasn't a financial analyst or a corporate executive. He was a builder. He understood the materials, the process, and the people. For the first time in years, the employees had a leader who spoke their language. Our vision was simple: to bring the company back to its roots. We invested in new equipment, reinstated Arthur's rigorous quality control standards, and focused on rebuilding relationships with clients. Jake's masterpiece was the creation of an apprenticeship program. He partnered with his old high school to bring in students from the woodshop program for paid internships, giving them real-world skills and a potential career path. He was a teacher again, but on a much larger scale. He was building a future not just for us, but for a new generation of craftspeople. I left my retail job and took over the administrative and marketing side of the business. We made a great team. My skills in management and customer relations complemented his expertise in the craft. We weren't just running a company, we were building something together, a true partnership in every sense of the word. About a year later, we finally bought our house. It wasn't a mansion. It was a modest 3-bedroom home with a big, sun-filled yard and, most importantly, a detached 2-car garage. We paid for the down payment with the first dividend check we earned from the revitalized company. The day we moved in, Jake walked into the empty garage, ran his hand along a dusty workbench left by the previous owner, and smiled. It was the most content I had ever seen him. We didn't do it for the money or the power. We did it for the justice of it all. We took back what was stolen and used it to build a legacy based on the values Jake's grandfather cherished: integrity, hard work, and the simple, profound joy of creating something real. Our life wasn't defined by fancy cars or stock portfolios, but by the quiet satisfaction of a day's work well done and the peace of knowing we had built it all on a foundation of our own making.